It's upon these hallowed grounds at the Lincoln Memorial that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous speech, "I Have a Dream." In those words, he echoed the thoughts of the president whose memorial these grounds hallow. He said these words, that he has a dream that all men would come together as one. We all know that man's laws are good, but God's laws are perfect and holy. And so as we begin our journey today, thinking about In God We Trust and God's holy law, not only do we think about the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, but we think about the words of Abraham Lincoln and the journey that he began so many years before. And so here we stand at the Lincoln Memorial. Inside of this very famous memorial, we find the inscriptions of both President Lincoln's second inaugural address and also of the Gettysburg Address. And it's the Gettysburg Address that I want to focus in on today as we think about God's holy law. In President Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, he began it with those words that we all remember. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He also said that as he wanted to honor the dead, those who had sacrificed their lives upon the field of battle, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that all these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. Of course, we know that the Gettysburg Address is a speech by President Lincoln and is one of the best known speeches in all of U.S. history, as well as Dr. Martin Luther King's speech that was also given on these hallowed grounds. In just over 2 minutes, Lincoln invoked the principles of human equality espoused by the Declaration of Independence and redefined the Civil War as a struggle not merely for the Union, but as a new birth of freedom that would bring true equality to all of its citizens and that would also create a unified nation. You know, we see in these words of President Lincoln and the honor of Gettysburg and the battle that was fought there, that there are the laws of man. But unfortunately, man's laws, man's ways don't always get it right. It's God's holy and perfect law that we want to focus in on today. Certainly, man can create laws and try to, we think about the Judeo-Christian ethic, but we want to think about the idea of the law of God as we begin our journey today. So as we begin this morning, as we're thinking about God's holy law, I want us to go back to that thought of President Lincoln, who led our nation as it struggled through the separation of the Union and the ugly issue of slavery during the Civil War. Unfortunately, our history also tells that story. And still today, the disgusting presence of prejudice exists among us in the journey that began so many years ago and found a strong voice with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. just over 50 years ago in our recent history, highlights the facts that man's ways are not always God's ways. And while this nation was founded upon the cause and course of freedom, there's also this blight upon our nation's history. And by this I mean that man can make laws, but only God's laws are perfect. And then only a heart bent towards righteousness will obey the laws that have been given. And we have these pillars up here on the stage for a reason, because we want you to be thinking about what is it that you are founding your life upon. What is it you're building your life upon? The way of God or the way of the world? Are you someone who pursues the path of righteousness, or are you just trying to not get caught? I'll just give you an example. There are the laws of man, and most often we think that the laws of man are given there to restrain us, that they are there in some instances to keep us from enjoying the freedoms that we would want had the law not be there. As an example, the laws regarding the speed limits in our area. How many people broke the speed limit law last week? Raise your hands. Some of you are lying and you need to pray. We'll talk about you later. And the reality is that from time to time, we do break the law relative to speeding limits. And on those rare occasions, when there is an officer of the law around, you also get the benefit of the speeding ticket. How many people have had a speeding ticket in the last year? Raise your hands. All right, last 2 years. All right, so relatively good. Breaking the law, not getting caught, as was evidenced by the hands. All right.
So there's a reality here, and what I want to point out is this fact that sometimes we see these laws and we don't really necessarily pay attention to them. There's almost like an apathy towards it, like, yeah, that's the speeding limit. And but the reality is that there is the law that we need to follow and obey. And so maybe some of us have an apathy towards the law, as it were. Let's take some of the words of our founding fathers. Patrick Henry, at the founding of our nation, said it cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians, not on religion, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ. For this very reason, peoples of other faiths have been afforded asylum, prosperity, and the freedom of worship here. Now, the reality is that there are a lot of people that would have a hard time with that kind of a statement today, and yet Patrick Henry, one of our founding fathers, made those exact words. As a matter of fact, our first president, George Washington, said this: of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. It is impossible to rightly govern the world without God and the Bible. Now, why would he say that? Why would he say that? Because he knew that the only people whose hearts are surrendered to God, and those who study and hide the Word of God in their hearts, and those who pursue the path of righteousness, could properly live out the intent of the founding fathers as found in our founding documents. In other words, when they wrote those documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, there was an intent that the people reading them would live according to the principles, not that were penned upon the paper, but rather that were penned upon their hearts. It was just a natural outward expression of that which they already believed in. Yet the truth is that man has been struggling against God's ways for some time. And although this is a great nation, and I love America, unfortunately, we're not a perfect people. We are a people who have somewhat of a sordid history, not only with the issue of slavery, but by the way that we treated the original inhabitants of this land. And these are things we can't get away from. It's the truth. And that's something we'll need to talk about in a few minutes as well. So then let's look, by contrast, at the law of God. What is it that God gives us in His law? What is it that He says to us today? And there are really three types of law that are found in the Bible. The first is the ceremonial law. The ceremonial law. This is the law related specifically to Israel's worship in ancient history. Its primary purpose was to point forward to Jesus Christ. These laws, therefore, were no longer necessary after Jesus' death and resurrection. And while we are no longer bound by ceremonial laws, the principles behind them to worship and love a holy God still apply. Jesus was often accused by the Pharisees of his day of violating the ceremonial law. Let's look at Leviticus here, chapter 1. Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man of you brings an offering unto the Lord, you shall bring an offering of animals from the herd of the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer it a male without defect. He shall offer it at the doorway of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. Now, you can understand that this is the ceremonial law that day regarding the worship of Israel in that period of time. And we don't worship with the sacrifice of animals anymore. As a matter of fact, the Bible teaches us that Jesus came as the perfect lamb without spot or blemish and offered up himself that we may have access to the grace of God in our lives. And so the ceremonial law, to a certain extent, has been done away with. Additionally, there was the civil law of the day, the civil law. It applied to the daily living in Israel. Because modern society and culture are so radically different from those days, different from that time and setting, not all of these guidelines can be followed specifically today. But the principles behind the commands are timeless and should guide our conduct. Jesus demonstrated these principles by example when he walked planet Earth. Look to Deuteronomy 20.